So I'm going to try to lay out my thinking on Obama foreign policy and the larger debate often seen inside of the United States about the role of the United States in the world over the next years. Questions that are not just about Obama and his record, which I will focus on, but also the future of the U.S. as a great power. The question that's always debated every 10 or 15 years in America, is America in decline? What is the future of the American role in the world under conditions of declining power? And then the question that's even more difficult to untangle and respond to, the question of if America is, relatively speaking, declining, if the world is going to be a more crowded world with more great powers from different parts of the world, north and south, east and west, what is the future of this international order that the U.S. spent so many decades building, what I sometimes call the liberal international order, rule-based, open, built around all sorts of different institutions and partnerships. When the world, as I put it in a foreign affairs article, becomes less American, will it become less liberal? What happens on the other side of the American century? But I want to start and really look at those questions through the eyes of the Obama administration and say mostly very positive things about President Obama and his team over the last 4.5 years. I do think there is a coherent vision and a coherent set of initiatives and agendas to push the world in the right direction, to kind of bend history. That's what we always do when we're interested in foreign policy, doing a little bit more here to see if it will create conditions that will down the way create greater growth or more cooperation. So I think there is a coherent vision. I would describe it as pragmatic internationalism, a view of problem solving, of international cooperation, very much without ideological pretensions and grand visions really of a future. I study and teach international politics at Princeton in the Woodrow Wilson School. So Woodrow Wilson is always looming there, if not his picture, at least the building with his name. But Obama is not quite like Wilson, and so I'll try to say something about that tonight. I think Obama's greatest challenge is domestic. I think that the slow recovery, the deep and sharp partisan conflict in the United States is very disturbing and very detrimental to the coherent agenda that I think is there. And I think that the House Republicans are really a source of a lot of this, very hostile, that in some ways dedicated to trying to prevent a successful administration to finish its term. So what does that mean? It means opposing policies that might allow Obama to say, I've succeeded, or this is an accomplishment, whether it's immigration reform or something else. That gap is not simply a gap between partisans and on the right and Obama. It's a more general tendency in American politics. Political scientists who talk about how do we measure partisan divide, and they come up with metrics based on voting behavior in Congress. They have found that the divide between liberals and conservatives, Republicans and Democrats is as wide today as it's been since the 1870s. I don't know what the 1870s were like, I wasn't there, but I don't think it was quite as nasty as it is today. I think that there is something that's really quite difficult and dysfunctional, even in a political system which celebrates division. Madison, the Federalist Papers, we expect this, and we designed a system so that we could check each other and work through this. So it's not, in that sense, outside of the tradition, but it is something that has to be looked at, and I hope that politicians of goodwill will make the next few years a little bit better than the past. But it does mean, I think, that given the resistance in the Senate, in the House, but in the Senate, there won't be new treaties, no climate change action, no law of the seas, even though the Pentagon wants it, no arms control that requires a treaty. These are basic conditions that the U.S. will not be able to do big things when it requires ratification of agreements in Congress. And I think in the background, and we will see this more in the next presidential election term, the rise of the libertarian faction in the Republican Party, which has a very different critique of America and the world than the Bush-McCain Republicans, who were, in some sense, neoconservative, very much internationalist with a certain angle on internationalism. The libertarian, the Rand Paul Republicans have a very much more radical critique of the United States and are very willing to talk about dramatic shifts, pullbacks, defense budget decreases, and disengaging from various things, including NATO perhaps. So there will be in the future more what we might call existential debates about America's role in the world, and those on the side that I'm on of a very robust American internationalism will have to have a good game and have good ideas and have to step up to the plate to make the arguments in favor of engagement. Obama has been in office for 4.5 years, so we really can talk about his vision and his record. He came to office those years ago, 4.5 years, with really seeking a fresh start and with great ambition. He saw an opportunity to make a fresh start after 8 years, which were controversial, tied to 9/11 and the war on terror in Iraq. A chance for a Democrat to succeed a Republican. That's when a whole new team can come in. 1,000 political appointees across the administration flood into a new administration. And he himself represented a kind of fresh image for America, a new generation, non-traditional experiences, community organizing, and so forth. And as he has put it, the first Asian president. He lived in Indonesia and Hawaii. Went to Punahou, where my son goes to summer school. Has the last 3 years. Beautiful school in Honolulu. You've got to go there. But it's a feel. The student body is very fusion-oriented. It's full of different cultures and traditions, and that's what he grew up in, a kind of sense that there are lots of different types of people, and yet we are here together working on something. So there is a kind of, and of course the first African-American, which also gives a kind of new identity to him as a distinctive figure. At the same time, he came to office with constraints and crises that were pretty serious. Some would say as great as any new president has faced since Truman, perhaps. And we can talk about these problems, not just as crises that will come and go, but as more intractable, complex kinds of problems that are multi-generational in terms of struggles for solutions. Unfinished and popular wars in Iraq and Afghanistan, stalled peace talks in the Middle East, which are now to some extent being unstalled. North Korea and Iran building nuclear capacity, deteriorating non-proliferation treaty. European friends said this is in crisis after the Bush years. We've got to reinvigorate the NPT. Rising public debt, global financial crisis that was the worst since the Great Depression. $1 trillion overhang from these wars that were not funded by taxes. And then finally, a kind of sense of change in the global system, a kind of multipolar anxiety about the future of a rising China and the BRICS, the global south, the kind of new terrain for global politics. It's going to require new thinking and new kinds of foreign policy. So all of this confronted Obama when he came to office. My argument tonight really is that there is an approach in the context of all those crises and problems, even though events are making it difficult for Obama in many areas to gain traction. And I'm sure we'll talk about those problems tonight. As I said, I would describe Obama as a pragmatic internationalist, asserting U.S. leadership in tracking and tackling global problems, willing to work with anyone who comes to the table. Obama, as I read him, doesn't come with lots of ideological absolutes. Looking for the middle ground, believes in a kind of reasoned discourse. That's actually a term of art for a way of thinking about how to solve conflicts, of actually, enlightenment kind of mentality that rational souls can sit down and ponder problems and find a reasonable course. that's a kind of an old-fashioned way of thinking about the world, but it's very much in his mindset, I think. Which is why I think he's had a really difficult time figuring out how to deal with Republicans in the House of Representatives, because they don't seem to fit that mold of how you overcome problems. I would say emblematic of his approach is the Nuclear Safety Summit. You may be familiar with this initiative of multiple heads of state meeting. He held and hosted a conference in Washington several years ago, 47 heads of state coming together to talk about how to not necessarily reduce nuclear weapons, but make nuclear weapons and capacity more safe, safeguards, and ultimately with an idea of drawing these capacities down. So there is Obama as a kind of Professor Obama around a table of 47 heads of state talking about the issues and clearly giving his view, and no binding treaty would come out of this effort, so it's not an agreement that requires ratification, but it's a kind of voluntary collective action towards problems that we all agree are there. So I think he has more of a kind of let me lead rather than command. I think that's a kind of new style. Watchwords, pragmatism, coalition building, leading from the front, but leading from behind. That's not a offensive phrase in Obama circles. Leading from behind can be kind of clever if the others who are leading from in front are doing things you want them to do and doing things with you in coalition. The Libya intervention, for example, is an example of that. He's comfortable with working with democracies and non-democracies. Questions that he asks, as I read him and as I follow his group, asking questions: what is the problem? How do you fix it? Who is willing to work with us on it? More comments I might make about Obama and kind of the philosophy. I would say it's a blend of realism and liberalism, which is very much an American approach to the world. You have both the kind of power perspective and the kind of liberal, open trade and institutional perspective. Realist in his emphasis on working with other great powers. Very much, you start with that. You start with China, you start with Russia, you have a reset, which of course has not fully worked. But you start with a willingness to have major states with their own equities, their own portfolios, their own regional agendas to kind of collaborate. This is something that Henry Kissinger would be very comfortable with, the kind of concert of Europe, which was what Henry wrote his doctoral dissertation on at Harvard all those years ago, a kind of collective governance system of great powers. That is something that's I think Obama is very comfortable with. It means engaging and respecting other great powers, accommodation, restraint, reciprocity. These are traditional ways of building frameworks of diplomacy and cooperation. China is a key example of this, putting the dialogues of strategic and economic dialogues into place, institutionalize it, and cutting it down and bringing it down to deputy level meetings with China. So a lot of that. The START treaty with Russia is another example of that realist type of behavior of starting with the important issues, power and order, and then working on from there. Liberal also, though, and this is very much part of Obama's mindset. And this liberal view is seen in support for the NPT and Global Zero, which I think he is sincerely trying to push forward. I think, and this is, don't quote me on this, but I think he's going to go to Hiroshima before his term is out, and there's going to be a moment there where he's going to talk about nuclear weapons and disarmament at that site. Maybe it will be in August of next summer, I don't know. But that is something that he cares about, a kind of arms control and disarmament agenda. And his giving full reign to Secretary of State Hillary Clinton's own very creative efforts at the State Department, which I was impressed with, adding development to diplomacy, women's issues, and clearly looking at building social constituencies for reform at the domestic level and at the international level, NGOs and non-traditional security issues. This is all Obama on the liberal side. These two these two parts of Obama are very much American. Every post-war president, with a few exceptions, but I think of Truman, who was a liberal in his view of the importance of the United Nations, and his Secretary of State, Dean Acheson, who was a tough realist who, yes, the UN was okay in Acheson's view, but really, let's get on with it. So this kind of duality, the hard side, the more kind of progressive side working together, and I think it's been very, very productive over the years. Obama's pragmatic and often sober internationalism can be seen in his Oslo speech, which he wrote himself, I understand it, and it's a real intellectual product that you should read over a glass of wine and think about it as kind of a set of ideas that a very powerful person has sat down himself to think about. He says in that Oslo Nobel Peace Prize speech, a very embarrassing prize, I'm sure, for him, so early in the administration, but he did say in a kind of counter-cyclical way to an Oslo Nobel Peace Prize setting that war has its appropriate role, this kind of Niebuhr-esque view of the sad tragedy of the world can never be perfected. He was pragmatic in quoting JFK, John F. Kennedy, in his Oslo speech. The famous lines of Kennedy's in his, I think, American University speech in the summer before his assassination: "Let us focus on a more practical, more attainable peace based not on a sudden revolution in human nature, but on the gradual evolution of human institutions." That is the essence of it. A kind of, we can't redo the world, but we can craft institutions to make us bias ourselves a little bit in the direction that we all want to go. He was liberal in his embrace of the rule of law and in international relations. In that Oslo speech, we have a moral and strategic interest in binding ourselves to certain rules of conduct, very much channeling FDR and JFK in that speech. So that's all very much the Obama view. Now, what has he done? And this is where there's a debate. What are the accomplishments? What's left to do? What can you do given the constraints? And my list is that there's a lot to debate, but there is something here that can be said. This is the product of 4.5 years. This is what we've done. Ending 2 wars, closing out Iraq in an acceptable manner, not doing what some people hoped could be done in Afghanistan, but not prolonging the agony and looking for some acceptable limit that would allow for what was the original cause of the intervention, Al-Qaeda, not to be a base there anymore. So there will be provisions of a lingering security role that will keep that in check. Stabilizing relations with China. I'll say more about that. I know China looms larger in Latin America than ever before. The so-called pivot. I would not have used that language. I would have been very quiet about the pivot, but I would have pivoted. And we can talk about the pivot. It's not really a pivot in the sense of doing new things in Asia. It's really pivoting from 2 wars to a kind of more globally oriented focus on Asia. Isolating Iran, willing to negotiate with Iran, but helping to bring the Europeans, because of that willingness, to a more tighter sanctions regime, the toughest sanctions ever. Strengthening the brand of the United States. I think in Europe and most of the world, except in the Middle East, the U.S. is more favorably seen than when he took office. Reestablishing nuclear arms control in the global arena. I think that's an agenda. Nothing we can say there's a deep accomplishment yet, but it's there. Embracing the G20 as a recognition that the governance system has to change. The UN Security Council will not be reformed. Stabilizing the economy after the world's most difficult crisis since the Great Depression. And I would say finally, resisting some interventions, including so far Iran and Syria. Some people have started to liken Obama to Eisenhower, who doesn't get dramatic popular press, that people forget about Eisenhower. but he was, in many eyes, a very successful president, partly by agreeing not to do things. On 2 occasions, he said no to his military on using nuclear weapons. He was in competition for the Republican nomination with Douglas MacArthur, who almost won and who was committed to using nuclear weapons in Korea. So there could have been a very different world. So Eisenhower, we don't credit Eisenhower for that. It's a non-event, but an important one. And I think some of what we will ultimately, history will say about Obama is that he may have held back, and that was a good thing, and we can debate that. His greatest disappointments when I go to the State Department, when I hear my colleagues talk about, well, wish we had done more or could do more. I think the Middle East peace process is a huge disappointment, set up by the Cairo speech. Not a lot of progress there, a very complicated and not that I have the solutions, but a very messy policy towards the Arab Spring and towards Egypt. Not an easy policy problem to tackle, but not a lot of easily identify a policy direction as well. Nothing very bold on global warming, and in some ways, as somebody who has been very supportive of the overall philosophy of Obama foreign policy, not moving as much as I would like, given my past writings, and so my criticism of the war on terror as Bush pursued it, ending the war on terror, which means revisiting the Patriot Act and the surveillance programs, and yes, torture, that was very important to draw a bright line. Guantanamo Bay, still lingering, and a very ambivalent view about drones, which I somehow finding a way to multilateralize and make limits on that kind of warfare, which may be necessary in the age we live in, but need to be put in a kind of normative and internationally agreed upon context so that they don't come back to bite America later on. So I'm surprised a little bit at that. Just one thing before I conclude about China. I think a very robust strategy, the general view is to engage China, but also counterbalance China. The U.S. is engaged in counterbalancing China, and it's something that actually is very functional because China tends to cooperate most when you have your hand like this. And when you talk honestly about supporting Taiwan, and when you talk honestly about human rights, and North Korea, it's expected and it's respected and it's reciprocated with a seriousness. So I think that it's not bad to be tough with China, but you want to at the same time have a very intelligent policy of engagement, which I think the strategic dialogue involves. I think reassurance of allies, re-engaging ASEAN. The most surprising, Asians who I go to Asia all the time. Asians are surprised about pushing forward on ASEAN and ratifying the Treaty on Amity and Cooperation, which then allowed the U.S. access to the ASEAN network and made friends in Southeast Asia and set up what I think was a brilliant move several years ago by Hillary Clinton on adding America's voice to ASEAN efforts to make sure that China settles the South China Sea in an orderly way, an agreed upon way. That was a great move, just a terrific effort to be on the right side, I think, of issues. And Kurt Campbell and others at the State Department were very important in that initiative. Going to meetings, very important. Showing up in Asia at meetings is important, even though you are jet-lagged and tired, you've got to be there. It's not just symbolic, it's real. And they've been doing this, and Hillary Clinton, of course, has the markings of a weary traveler, so that at least she did, so you can see that. Courting South Korea, the final thing about Asia is South Korea is one of the great success stories of the last decade. A country that has made transitions that are very much in the mold of stakeholder embracing of a system of multilateral trade and security cooperation, the hallmarks of the system the U.S. has devoted itself to, the State Department and Defense Department going together, the Secretary and Secretary 2+2 talks in Seoul with their counterparts, the first time that was ever done. Very important signal. And of course, Seoul under President Lee, and now we'll see with Madam Park, you have a reciprocal commitment and willingness to do great things on the global stage, hosting the second meeting of that nuclear summit talk series that I mentioned, and supporting other kinds of multilateral events and development, hosting the G20 process. So Korea is a country to watch, is a country to see as it rises up and finds opportunities to leverage its position in the global system. So regional strategy, creating finally in Asia institutions to allow China to signal restraint. This comes out of my own work on institutions and strategic restraint. Rising states have a problem, the problem that post-Bismarck Germany had of self-encirclement based on power growth. And so how do you grow and become more influential on the global stage without triggering a counterattack or a counterbalance? The problem that Germany faced under Wilhelm II and other countries have. Well, it's tying yourself to other countries, signaling your benign intentions through multilateral cooperation, involving yourself in institutions. So the United States needs to be finding tools for China to use to signal restraint. That's very important. Finally, final word, Mr. Chairman, just one word about back to kind of the big picture. I think that Obama has got the right type of vision. I think that others would as well, but I think he has it of a kind of engagement with the world that is multifaceted, that recognizes that power shifts are underway, but that doesn't mean that leadership is not necessary, maybe necessary even more than in the past. And a kind of sense of mutual security vulnerability, or what I describe as a recognition that the greatest master trend in the world today is rising security interdependence. That we as a world face threats that are diffuse and uncertain and globalized. We are in a world where people that we didn't know about before could pose threats to us through health pandemics, or certainly terrorism, or economic policies that reverberate our way. So the world is connected in ways, not just economically, but in terms of security. The way other people live, the way other people act in more places matter than ever before. How they burn energy, how they educate, how they engage in public health, how they treat their minorities, how they abide by international agreements. All of that matters in more places, in more ways than ever before. Rising security and independence. The first time I actually was aware that somebody named Senator Obama was up and running as a politician was an interview he gave to Roger Cohen, I think, of the International Herald Tribune. It may not be the right journalist, but he basically said part of being a leader is signaling your commitment to restrain the use of your power. And that was like perfect Ikenberry thinking. That the irony that world politics tells you is that actually being able to credibly tell other people that you're not going to be nasty and aggressive makes them more willing to work with you. And under conditions of unipolarity, under conditions of a one superpower world, the United States has had to think about that. And I think Obama understood that it's not simply marching around the world doing things and insisting that other people follow, but to restrain yourself and to be a little bit more quiet and to help frame debates. Doesn't mean you aren't as powerful or influential, but it means that you indirectly try to shape and, as I suggested, bend history through sustained engagement over the long term.